The garage smelled the way it always had, motor oil and dry wood and something faintly metallic that Ross couldn't name but had stopped trying 2 years ago. He stood in the doorway with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking at the shape under the canvas tarp the way he always did on Saturday mornings, when there was nothing else demanding his attention. The light came through the high window in a single pale bar and fell across the covered hood, and Ross let himself stand there for a moment before the day started pulling at him. His daughter Penny was still asleep upstairs. She was 12, and 12 meant sleeping past 9 on weekends, which meant Ross had about 40 minutes before the house came back to life. He set his mug on the workbench and pulled back one corner of the tarp, just far enough to see the front quarter panel. The paint had faded to something between burgundy and brown, and there were places along the lower door where the metal had pitted and flaked. It wasn't pretty. It hadn't been pretty when he'd bought it for $80 from a salvage lot in Sudbury 11 years ago. And it wasn't pretty now. But Ross had stopped seeing what it looked like a long time before that. He only saw what he knew it was. He covered it back up and went inside to make breakfast. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, forwarded through the Heritage Auto Club he'd been a loose member of for years. The Lakeview Corporate Charity Showcase was an annual event organized by Hargrove Development, one of those company-sponsored afternoons where polished cars sat in a plaza, while executives mingled with donors and local media photographed everything. The proceeds went to a children's hospital fund, which was the part Ross had said yes to. The club had been short on entries for the heritage category, and someone had put his name forward. He hadn't told Penny about it until the Wednesday before. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and he'd mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, matter-of-factly, without build-up. In the space between her finishing a sentence and starting the next, she'd looked up. "The old one?" she said. "The only one I have." She'd thought about it for a second, then nodded. "Can I come?" He'd said yes before she finished asking. They left the house at 8:30 on the morning of the event, the car loaded onto the borrowed flatbed that Ross drove slowly and carefully through the Saturday traffic. Penny sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled up, earbuds in but volume low enough that she could still talk, which she did intermittently, asking questions about the route or about the car or about nothing in particular, the way she always did when she was comfortable. Ross answered each one. He liked her questions, he always had. The Hargrove Development Building was a glass and steel tower at the north end of the downtown core, and the plaza in front of it had been transformed by the time they arrived. Banners ran along the perimeter. A small stage sat at one end with a sound system already playing something soft and forgettable. The display areas were roped off in neat sections, and the cars already positioned there were exactly what Ross had expected. Mint-condition muscle cars, professionally restored classics with chrome that caught the light like mirrors, a couple of vintage European roadsters that looked like they'd never seen rain. A man in a blazer with a clipboard met them at the staging entrance. His name tag said Kyle, and he had the particular manner of someone running an event on not quite enough sleep, efficient but slightly frayed at the edges. "Ross Callender?" Kyle said, checking his list. "That's me." Kyle looked at the flatbed. He looked at the shape under the tarp. He wrote something down without saying what. "Heritage category, far left section. I'll send someone to help you position once you've unloaded." They unloaded without help. Ross backed the flatbed in, walked the car down the ramp slowly, and positioned it in the marked space. Penny handed him the tarp when he asked for it, and she helped him secure the edges when the wind picked up. They had a system, even for things they'd only done once or twice. That was just how they operated. It was about 20 minutes after they'd set up that Vivian Hargrove arrived. Ross didn't know who she was when he first saw her. He noticed her the way you notice someone who moves differently than the crowd around them, with a certainty of trajectory, the kind of walk that expected the space ahead to clear. She was perhaps 40 in a blazer the color of slate, her hair pulled back severely enough that it seemed deliberate. She was accompanied by 2 men in suits who were clearly there to take notes and agree with whatever she said, and she was moving down the row of display cars with the manner of someone conducting an inspection rather than attending a charity event. She stopped when she reached Ross's section. She looked at the car. It was not covered anymore. Ross had pulled the tarp back 40 minutes earlier, and the car sat in the thin morning light looking exactly as it always had. Worn, patched in places, the windscreen clouded with age, the chrome dulled to a matte silver that needed work. It looked like something someone had given up on. Vivian Hargrove looked at it for about 4 seconds. Then she turned to Kyle, who had reappeared at some point in the last few minutes, and she said at a volume that carried clearly across the roped section and to the small group of early visitors who had begun to gather, "Who authorized this?" Kyle blinked. "I'm sorry, this," she pointed at the car, not at Ross, at the car. This is a charity showcase. We have media here. We have donors who have sponsored this event to the tune of significant money. And this," she paused as though searching for a word that conveyed enough, "this is what we put in the heritage section." Ross said nothing. He was standing beside the car with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he said nothing. "I checked the registration," Kyle started. "It's a verified entry the club submitted. I don't care about the club's submission." Her voice hadn't risen. That was the thing about it. It hadn't risen at all. It was calm and precise, and somehow worse for it. "This car is a liability. It looks like it was pulled from a field. It doesn't belong here, and it reflects poorly on everything around it." One of the men with her was writing something down. The other one was looking at his phone. A man standing near the rope with his son, maybe 8 or 9 years old, had gone quiet. An older couple who'd been examining the roadster 2 spaces down had stopped and were watching. A woman with a camera press badge around her neck had turned. Ross looked at the camera. Then he looked at Penny, who was standing on the other side of the car. She was watching Vivienne Hargrove with an expression he recognized, the particular stillness that meant she was taking something in and deciding what to do with it. He gave her the smallest shake of his head. She looked at him. Then she looked back at the car. Vivienne Hargrove was still talking to Kyle. "Get someone to have it removed. We can fill the space with the backup Buick from the west lot." "Call whoever handles the flatbeds, ma'am," Ross said. She turned. She seemed slightly surprised to be addressed, as though she'd been having a conversation that didn't include him. "My name is Ross Callender," he said. "I'm the registered owner of this vehicle, and I'm the one who submitted the entry through the Heritage Auto Preservation Club of Northern Ontario. I've done nothing wrong." She studied him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much time this was going to take. "I'm not suggesting you've done anything wrong," she said, moderating her tone precisely enough to seem reasonable without conceding anything. "I'm suggesting this vehicle isn't appropriate for this event. It's in disrepair. It's not presentable. It's a 1965 Bizzarini 5300 GT Strata," Ross said. "There are fewer than 200 of them in existence, fewer than 30 in North America. I've been told by 2 independent appraisers that this one, even in its current condition, would move somewhere between $1.4 and $1.9 million at auction." The plaza had gotten very quiet. Vivienne Hargrove didn't say anything for a moment. One of the men who had been taking notes had stopped taking notes. "Bizzarini," said the older man who had been looking at the roadster nearby. He said it quietly, more to himself than to anyone, but in the quiet it carried. "That's a Bizzarini 65 Strata," Ross said. "I found it in a salvage lot in Sudbury. It had been misidentified for about 30 years as a kit car. I bought it for $80. The man with the son near the rope was leaning forward now. The press photographer had drifted 3 steps closer without appearing to intend to. "The body is steel," Ross continued, still in the same even tone, "so the surface corrosion looks worse than it is. The engine is original and complete. The chassis has no structural damage. It needs a restoration. It doesn't need a replacement." Vivienne Hargrove looked at the car again. The expression on her face had changed in a way that was hard to name exactly. It wasn't embarrassment, not quite. It was the micro-adjustment of someone who had made a confident assessment in public and was now publicly being presented with data that contradicted it. She said, "I wasn't aware of the provenance." "No," Ross said. "You weren't?" The older man had stepped past the rope. Kyle started to say something and then didn't. The man crouched beside the rear wheel arch and looked at something on the underside of the body. "The door badge is still on," the man said, almost to himself. "Right side, both sides," Ross said. The man stood up slowly. He was maybe 65, with a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and the hands of someone who'd spent a lot of time working on things. He looked at Ross with an expression that was something close to respect. "I'm Bernard Tews," the man said. "I wrote a chapter on Bizzarini production history for a Mark encyclopedia in 2009. I haven't seen an unrestored Strata in person in about 15 years. He put his hand out and Ross shook it. Bernard turned to look at the car the way some people look at things they know very well. Not casually, not superficially, but with the kind of attention that comes from having thought about something for a long time. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the car, and he didn't say anything for almost a full minute, and in that minute the small crowd that had gathered didn't say anything either. "The front clip is straight," Bernard said finally. "That's unusual. Most of the ones that survived got in accidents. The previous owner kept it under cover," Ross said. "He just didn't know what it was." Bernard nodded. He straightened up. He looked across the car at Vivienne Hargrove, who was still standing where she had been, and he said without any particular emphasis, "This is probably the most significant automobile at this event, by a considerable margin." The woman with the camera press badge had raised it. Vivienne Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then she said to no one in particular, Someone should update the event program to reflect the correct provenance. One of her men was already typing on his phone. Kyle appeared at Ross's elbow looking slightly stunned and said, "Can I get you anything? Coffee?" Ross said that would be fine. The morning moved around the car after that. People stopped, and Bernard answered their questions with the calm authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to hold a room. Penny had moved to stand beside the car and was listening, and sometimes she asked her own questions, and Bernard answered hers with the same patience he showed everyone else. The press photographer took pictures. An older woman who turned out to be a board member of the sponsoring charity came over and shook Ross's hand and told him the car was extraordinary, and he thanked her and meant it. Vivian Hargrove spent the remainder of the morning on the other side of the plaza. At one point in the early afternoon she walked past the heritage section again. There was a small cluster of people around the Bizzarini, not a crowd exactly, but a sustained and steady interest, people coming and going, pausing, asking questions, pulling out phones to take pictures. Ross was leaning against the rope with his coffee and watching Penny explain something to the young boy who had been there earlier with his father, pointing at the door badge and saying something that made the boy's eyes go wide. Vivian Hargrove stopped walking. She was perhaps 4 meters away, and she looked at the car and she looked at Penny and then she looked at Ross. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to, and they both knew it. She walked on. The drive home was quiet in the way that good days sometimes are, not empty but settled. Penny had the passenger window cracked and was watching the highway in the last of the afternoon light, and she was quiet for a long time before she said anything. "Bernard said it might be worth more than $2 million if it gets properly documented," she said. "Bernard might be right. Are you going to sell it?" Ross thought about the question the way he thought about most things she asked him, genuinely, without dismissing it or softening it. He thought about the salvage lot, the man at the desk who'd shrugged and said he couldn't be expected to know what everything was. He thought about the drive home from Sudbury 11 years ago, the car on the flatbed, Penny asleep in the back seat, 3 years old with her boots still on. "I don't know yet," he said. She seemed to accept that. She turned back to the window. "She should have asked first," Penny said. "Before she said anything, she should have just asked what it was." Ross looked at the road. "Yeah," he said. "She should have." They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to say more than that to understand each other. And when they got home, Ross backed the flatbed into the driveway and helped Penny walk the car down the ramps in the last of the evening light. And together they put the tarp back over it and went inside.